During our introduction to the Gospels, we pointed out that the Gospels are the first four books of the New Testament. So we come to Matthew as the first Gospel, the very first book of the New Testament. Um, Even though it's the first book that we come to, and it's the first Gospel in the pages of the New Testament. It probably wasn't the first one written. A lot of people do say that, they think Matthew was written, and a lot of that comes down to usually to it just because it's listed first. I mean, not a lot of good reasons, but that you'll hear some discourse about it if you look into it. But for the most part, most scholars and most people who study it believe that Mark was probably written first for a lot of reasons, because it's shorter, um, because a lot of the content in Mark is also in Matthew and Luke, and Luke was almost certainly written later as well. And so Mark was probably written first. About 90% of Mark is in Matthew, sometimes word for word. And so scholars believe that Matthew would have used Mark for a source, as well as having some of his own information to add. So there's a couple different formulations about a previous source, a previous unknown source of written sayings of Jesus. Matthew obviously adds other things that he was familiar with, whether it was passed down orally or some of them could have been written down and we don't have any surviving copies. It made its way into Matthew. So that's all speculation, but there's speculation that there might have been a previous source that Matthew used, whether it was Matthew's own notes or another apostle's notes of the sayings of Jesus. So that other source, is often called a Q for the first letter of the German word for source. So that if an American or an Englishman would have invented that theory, it probably would have been called the S source instead of the Q. So same thing. Um, and that would be information that probably would have been shared with some of the other gospel writers as well. And then there's further speculation that Matthew could have gotten, when I mentioned his own notes or information, content that's unique to Matthew that's not found in the other gospels is a lot of times referred to as a source M for Matthew. Um, so those are speculation, and those are all possibilities. But there's more support for Mark being a source for Matthew because of how much of it appears in Matthew and is expanded on and added to. So it's normal progression for things to really be expanded over time and added to rather than abbreviated, especially when they're trying to tell this, an important story. They're not likely to say, oh, well, you included too much details, let me shorten it. It's more likely that another writer would come and add some more things to it. So Matthew is it's officially and technically an anonymous document. It doesn't have Matthew's name on it in its original, or in the Greek manuscripts, the earliest Greek manuscripts. And it doesn't have the name Matthew within the body, sort of like the letters of Paul that will say Paul, an apostle. Um, It'll have the author's name specifically on there. So Matthew is technically anonymous, um, but there's wide belief that it was written, and early belief that it was written by Matthew, the tax collector and disciple of Jesus. Matthew was also named Levi, and we have the calling of Matthew in Matthew 9:9. Jesus' calling of Matthew from the tax booth. As he was sitting there working, doing his job, Jesus says, "Come and follow me," and he left and he followed him. The same account is given to us by Luke in chapter 5, Luke 5:27 and 28, and he's called Levi instead of Matthew. Matthew is also listed among the 12 apostles the 12 disciples who are called um, apostle, whom Jesus calls apostles. Um, these are first century Jewish followers of Jesus, and his name is listed in the list in Matthew chapter 10, and specifically verse 3 lists Matthew's name there. Matthew is a Jew, he's a Hebrew, um, probably born in that area, but certainly employed. He was a tax collector in Capernaum, where Jesus did a lot of his ministry. And his Hebrew name is Mattiyahu, which means the gift of Yahweh, or gift of the Lord. We have really, really early acceptance. Actually, we have uncontested acceptance of Matthew in the early church. Nobody ever doubted the acceptance of Matthew as scripture. And unchallenged Matthew's authorship of the gospel, even though it doesn't bear his name in the document, but Matthew as the author is unchallenged as well in early church history. We have no record of it being challenged. And as we mentioned previously in some of the quotes that we looked at, Matthew's gospel is quoted or referred to as early as the late 2nd century by church fathers and figures such as Papias, Irenaeus, and Origen. Some people date Matthew as early as 50 AD, the authorship of Matthew as early as 50. So if Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection was in 30, that's within 20 years. If it was 33, that's even closer. And here the later dates go as late as 65. So still prior to the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. And one of the big signs or signals that it was written before the destruction of the temple is that it foretells the destruction of the temple. And it doesn't capitalize on that to say, see, Jesus was telling the truth. So it seems it seems to be written in a time when the temple was, had not yet been destroyed. And it foretells the destruction of it in Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2. Is this about? Okay, Matthew. And Matthew was believed to be written from the Palestine area. He might have returned back to Capernaum or anywhere around that area. But let's see, Matthew's gospel, as we mentioned, is a Jewish gospel. They're all Jewish, but Matthew's has a particular emphasis on a lot of Jewish themes, such as, well, we'll get into some of these later, but the Messianic King. So the theme of Matthew, we said, is Matthew's presentation or portrait of Jesus is the Messianic King of the Jews. He's the Messiah that the Jewish people are waiting for. He is their king that they've been waiting to come and liberate them. So that's a prominent Jewish theme right there, the Jewish Messianic expectation. Let's see. Also, we mentioned that the different kind of sects of the Hebrews that arose during the intertestamental period. We had Hellenistic Jews who were more Greek in their thinking and accepting of Greek culture. And we said that Hebrew Jews were those who were really rooted in their original Hebrew culture. And they probably spoke Hebrew and or Aramaic, and were very familiar more with the Hebrew language. Paul in the book of Acts, said that he was a Hebrew he said that he was a Pharisee. But he writes in another place that he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, so a Hebrew in that time, in this Second Temple, first century Second Temple period, meant someone who was really more rooted in their original Jewish culture rather than Hellenized, or, as we would say, Americanized. In our culture, we know that there are some Jews who maybe try to keep more of a different culture that they came from, Yiddish Jews or other kinds of Jews. And then we see other people who would be, well, we wouldn't even be able to tell. They're, so blended in with us that they just look like our same culture. So the same thing in the first century period. They were Hebraic Jews, Hebrew Jews that were called Hebrews, that were more proud and more adherent to their own culture. And so Matthew is probably even though, as I said, Jesus is a Jewish Messiah, he is a Jew, and all of the characters in the Gospels are Jews for the most part. I mean, there are some Romans, but the main players and Jesus himself, they're Jews. But the Gospel of Matthew is a little bit more Jewish in that way, in that it probably has a Hebrew flavor or emphasis to it that could give us a signal of who it was really meant to, who Matthew was really reaching out to, or who Matthew really was, that was really his background. So see, Matthew, so his theme is obviously Jesus. The Messiah has come. Jesus is the Messiah of the Jews. He is the Jewish king. Let's see. Matthew 2:2 and Matthew 21:5-9, and then chapter 27, verse 37, all reference Jesus as the King of the Jews. So in chapter 2, when the visitors from the east are coming to find Jesus and worship him, they're asking, where is he who is born King of the Jews? They're asking Herod that. And all the way through to his crucifixion, well, in chapter 21 is his triumphal entry as king into, riding on the donkey, and the people are laying palm branches in his path and shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And Matthew quotes, let's see. I think he quotes, is it Zechariah? I didn't write that one down. But so Matthew quotes an Old Testament prophecy that of your king is coming to you lowly and riding on a donkey, the colt full of a donkey. So he's referring to Jesus specifically as your king is coming to you. And of course, like I said, this is the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, and everything goes downhill from there, and he ends up being crucified, arrested, crucified, buried. And of course, then he was risen from the dead. But at his crucifixion, in chapter 27, Pilate puts the inscription, the sign on his cross that says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in 3 languages. So we have 3 references right here to Jesus as King of the Jews. And then we talked about Matthew's gospel. It starts out with a genealogy. It starts out in verse 1 with the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, the son of David. Or maybe it's the other way around, son of David, the son of Abraham, the son of David. One of those. So it's showing Jesus coming from the line of Abraham, and then more specifically from the line of David. And that is in the very first verse of chapter 1, as well as verse 17. Because then in chapter 1, verse 17, Matthew makes another apologetic or a proof for Jesus' messiahship by noting a pattern that from a pattern of 14 generations, he said, from Abraham to David were 14 generations. From David to the exile in Babylon was 14 generations. And from the Babylonian exile to Jesus have been 14 generations, or were 14 generations. So he uses both of those. Verse 1 and verse 17 sort of are bookends for the genealogy, which the genealogy details, that he really is descended from David and from Abraham, as the Messiah was supposed to be. Another theme that is a very Jewish theme and a messianic theme is Matthew presents Jesus as the new Moses. There are a lot of parallels that Matthew uses. And then also I could insert right here, and we'll look at it throughout this whole time. But we'll look at it a little bit more again later. But this is sort of one of Matthew's many allusions to the Old Testament. So Matthew uses the Old Testament and quotes it a lot. And sometimes direct quotes, sometimes allusions. So one of those is the presentation of Jesus, particularly his descendant, his genealogy from the line of David, and of course they're all descended from Abraham, as the Jewish people. But Jesus is the new Moses. He's presented sort of as the new Moses. You remember how he was. The evil King Herod tried to kill him by having all of the babies in the regions around Bethlehem killed. And as a consequence of that, his mother and Joseph took him and they fled into Egypt, right? So that's very reminiscent about the Pharaoh in the book of Exodus trying to prevent the deliverer Moses from being born, around the time of Moses' birth, anyway. And also, Matthew quotes, let's see, do I have that written down? Matthew quotes, I have this in two different spots. Hosea 11:1, when he notes that Jesus moves back from Egypt, of course with his parents. So his parents and him, they moved back to Egypt, from Egypt to Nazareth. And in Matthew 2:15, he quotes from the prophet Hosea saying, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." Again, a deliberate quote of the Old Testament for the purpose of showing that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus passes through the waters of baptism when he's baptized, and then immediately he fasts 40 days in the wilderness. So that's very similar to Moses as well, how the children of Israel passed through the Red Sea. Moses went up on the mountain and was up there fasting with God for 40 days and 40 nights. Then in chapters 5 and 6, Jesus goes up onto a mountain or a hillside and proceeds to teach, where he is giving the new law of the kingdom of God. I mentioned that it starts out with the Beatitudes, and I always think of those as like the Christian 10 Commandments, right? Even though there are only 9 of them, I count them often, and try to not try to make it work. You don't want to try to make it work out, but it is pretty similar. It's a list of blessed are those, blessed are they. But it's reminiscent of the 10 Commandments. I think it still is reminiscent of it, even though there are only 9 of them. But he teaches a whole lot more and gives a whole lot more teachings and laws of the kingdom, the way to live in the kingdom, teaching us the heart of God, expounding what the law really means, what God really expects, and so forth in his kingdom. in much the way the book of Deuteronomy does. Um, and actually the whole Pentateuch from Exodus on to Deuteronomy gives I think the count is 613 laws, so not just the 10 commandments, but the story continues, and there's more and more and more laws having to do with the priesthood and the building of the tabernacle and the king and how to live in the land and all of that as well. So that's very reminiscent too, because Jesus, the Beatitudes are just a few verses, and then Jesus continues teaching all the way through. Um, it takes up those two chapters. Let's see, the new Moses. So Jesus says several times, repeatedly, you see a pattern of him saying, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And a lot of times he's quoting the Old Testament. And this reminds me of when Moses said that the Lord himself will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brethren, right? Speaking of Jesus, the Messiah. And he goes on to say, him you shall hear. Remember we read that, and whoever does not hear his voice or his words, which I shall give to him, God is saying, I will require it of him. In other words, you must listen to him. So he's not Moses, but he's the new Moses. So he's saying, you have heard it said, but I say to you. Then later on he says, do not think I have come to destroy the law and the prophets, but I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Heaven and earth shall not pass away. Not one jot or tittle will pass from the law. Heaven and earth will pass away, but not one jot or tittle will pass from the law until all is fulfilled, right? So he has several mentions of the law there. Another part of that is he summarizes the law for us other times as well. When he is asked what is the greatest commandment in the law, and he tells them it is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second one is, greatest command is to love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, on these two commands hang all of the law and the prophets. So that's one summary of the whole Old Testament. If you go back to the Sermon on the Mount that we were just talking about, chapters 5 and 6, he says, he gives the golden rule, as we call it. Whatsoever you would have others do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. So he summarized the law of the prophets, the law of the Old Testament, in one sentence this time, in one saying. I guess it is one sentence, right? Yeah. A couple other parallels with Moses. He feeds the multitude in the wilderness, the feeding of the 5,000. And also, another distinct feature of Matthew's gospel. Matthew's gospel is made up of 5 major teaching sections of Jesus. So this chapters 5 and 6 that we're talking about, the Sermon on the Mount, is one of 5 major teaching sections in which Jesus teaches and performs miracles in Matthew. So with it, Jesus' teaching can be, kind of divided up. It's almost like 5, you could divide it up in 5 different books, sort of like the books of Psalms. It's all the same book in the Bible, but you can divide it up into, the 5 books. But it's also reminiscent of the Pentateuch, which are 5 books. Is this a Christian Pentateuch? A Christian Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Well, Matthew has 5 books of the teachings of Jesus, all in one book. So that's, and we'll look at more of that. We'll look at those 5 sections in a little bit. And then finally, the new Moses, Jesus appears on the mountain in chapter 17. He takes 3 of his closest disciples, and he is transfigured before them. His clothes become white as snow, and he's seen there speaking with Moses and Elijah on the mountain. Moses is obviously Moses. He's the original lawgiver of Israel. And Elijah is considered the forerunner of the prophets. He's not the first prophet, but he's, the major prophetic He's one of the first ones, but he's the major prophetic figure. Samuel is sort of like the first prophet. You can consider Moses a prophet, but he's considered the lawgiver, and Samuel is sort of considered the last judge in the period of judges. Um, so Jesus is standing there talking with Moses and Elijah, and that's very significant because, as we mentioned, Jesus makes mention of the law and the prophets. He's here to fulfill the law and the prophets. On this saying, hang all of the law and the prophets. So Jesus is the new Moses. Now Jesus is also the new David as the Messianic king. The theme that we looked at a little bit that's traced throughout the Gospel of Matthew, particularly with those three mentions of him as king or king of the Jews, and also the title Son of David that's given to him is that implies, a descendant of David, the Messianic king. And then Jesus is also presented by Matthew as the new Israel. So not only is he the new Moses and the new David, he is the new Israel. Israel itself is a forerunner or precursor to Jesus, and is kind of a foreshadowing of Jesus' life. For one, Jesus is born miraculously, as the children of Israel were, descended from Abraham, born miraculously when Abraham and Sarah were past the age of childbearing. As we mentioned, Jesus comes out of Egypt. He's called out of Egypt after fleeing there. And Matthew quotes from the prophet Hosea that says, out of Egypt I have called my son. Again, the baptism, because not just Moses passed through the waters of the Red Sea, but the whole nation of Israel did. The 40-day fast in the desert is reminiscent of Israel's 40-year wandering in the desert. And Jesus' 12 disciples are similar to and parallel the 12 tribes of Israel. And then finally, not just the title Son of David, but also the title Son of God is applied to Jesus as well in the book of Matthew. And this is an allusion to Exodus 40:22. It's not really an allusion to it, I guess. It's more of a connection you can draw. Exodus 4:22, God calls Israel his firstborn son. When he's giving a message to Pharaoh and saying, for Moses to tell them to let my people go, let my firstborn son come into the wilderness and worship me, something to that effect. But Israel is called God's firstborn son, and so that title, Son of God, it is an allusion to that, Jesus, and indicative of Jesus as the new Israel.